Hi, this is Bob Lord from Hacklore.org, and you're listening to Firewalls Don't Stop Dragons.
Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Firewalls Don't Stop Dragons. I'm your host, Kerry Parker, and today we have episode 466 for February 2nd, 2026. Real quick, before we start, thanks to everybody who responded to the listener survey. I'm still going through some of the responses, but there's been some great stuff in there, so thank you very much. If I find anything major in there, I will pass that along, but otherwise, just know that I have read your responses and will be taking them into consideration. So I've already chosen the random 5 winners and notified all 5 winners of my book from those respondents of the survey. So if you sent in the survey, definitely check your email inbox and maybe check your spam folder just in case. I'll send out an initial email to make sure that you get it. And then once I know that you've got it, I will send you a link to download a copy of the book. And also welcome to the new patrons. I'm glad we got a few new patrons with the promotion. At this point, I've sent out all the Dragon Challenge coins, and I hope you enjoy them. And, hey, maybe post a picture of the coin. If you post it on social media and tag me, I will definitely like and repost. And you can find all my social media handles under the contacts page on Firewalls Don't Stop Dragons. Okay, so today we are talking with Bob Lord. I've interviewed him once before. We talked about the LastPass breach when that happened. And Bob is a great guy with a lot of amazing experience in the security realm and just a fun guy to talk to. And he's got a new project called Hacklore, and you can find out all about it by going to hacklore.org. There's a link, of course, in the show notes. There's actually a lot of links in today's show notes. And the basic premise is there's been a lot of security advice over the years that it's been given out by maybe security professionals, maybe journalists, maybe people like me that has gotten stale or maybe is not as important as we've made it out to be. And Bob is basically saying we need to stop giving that advice because people only have a limited amount of time and resources for these kind of things, and they should be focused on things that are really going to pay off. And there's some controversial stuff in here, so it's going to be an interesting discussion. So real quick before we get into it, the only real jargon I think we throw around in here, we talk about MFA or 2FA or multi-factor authentication or two-factor authentication or sometimes called two-step authentication. It is confusing. We need to settle on those terms and because it becomes confusing to the people trying to do these things. But I think that's really the only lingo we throw around without really defining it. So that's all I got. Let's get right to my interview with Bob Lord. Bob Lord was a senior technical advisor at the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, or CISA, and the chief security officer at the Democratic National Committee and Yahoo's chief information security officer. You've been around, Bob. You're also CSO in residence at Rapid7 and headed up Twitter's information security program. It's first security hire, apparently. And now you are an adjunct advisor at the Institute for Security and Technology. And you were here 3 years ago when we talked about the LastPass breach. So welcome back, Bob.
Thank you very much. It's great to be here.
And it's been too long. That was a really important one. I remember the breach happened, and that was a pretty monumental thing. And I was glad to chance to talk to you then. But now you've got this new thing you're doing, and it's kind of a portmanteau with folklore and hacking that we're going to talk about today, Hacklore. And so let's start by maybe where that came from. You've been obviously in cybersecurity for many years at many places. Again, Yahoo, DNC, Twitter, Red Hat, AOL, Netscape, and there's even...
Yeah, you finally got to Netscape.
Yeah.
People are going to have to go Google that.
Oh, I was a user. When I was in college, I was totally a Netscape Navigator user. And so, obviously you've seen a lot of different cybersecurity best practices. You were around almost before there were such a thing, before the internet was a thing. So how did the Hacklore project come about, and how has that been informed by your myriad experiences?
Yeah, so you're right to point out the long history here, and that advice that we give to everyday folk has evolved over time in response to the technology landscape and obviously the threat landscape. And so the roots, I guess there are a couple of major touch points. One is that at the DNC, there was the 2016 hack, and then I joined in the beginning of 2018. And so one of the things I did is put together a checklist of things for folks to stay secure. And one of the things that I noted, even back then, was that there was a lot of advice that purported to be aimed at people working on campaigns and just everyday folks, but it was just wrong and needed to be retired. I had people asking me, for example, people working on campaigns, they'd ask, like, how do I protect myself when I'm working in a coffee shop? And this was great that they would come and ask the security people for advice. So, hats off to them for being bold. But the reality was that all of the attacks that we were seeing looked very similar. They were tied back to reusing passwords, not having MFA, not having applied all the software updates, things like that. And so when they would ask us, what should we do to stay safe when we're working in a coffee shop? The answer was really just the basics. They were not going to be attacked, statistically speaking, by evil baristas using 0 days. That's just not how it works in the real world. It works like that in the movies. But that's not what we were seeing. And so we put together the DNC checklist, which it's still out there. It's a nonpartisan document. So there's no politics involved there. And it really is just to help everyday people improve their security posture. And again, I want to just emphasize this. We need to occasionally go back and reevaluate, reconsider the tactics that will stop the most common crimes today. And I'm old enough to remember when spreadsheets had an F9 button so that you would have to recalc because it was too computationally expensive to go back and recalc everything. So we need to do that every now and then. So I started Hacklore.org as a way to really push back against some of these persistent myths, but more importantly, to give room for the good advice to take hold. I don't know about you. You probably can school me on this a fair amount, but my personal experience has been that no matter what people tell me, the reality is when I observe their behavior is that they have the busy lives and that they're willing to invest really just a few minutes per year to improve their security posture. Yeah. Sometimes you can get lucky and you can convince them to spend more, but we really need to figure out how to reward the time that they do give us with advice that's going to reduce the chances of them losing control of accounts or their devices. So that's how that all happened.
Well, as part of this, you put out an open letter signed by a lot of very noteworthy people, and you would strongly encourage people to stop propagating 6 specific pieces of security advice that are either not effective or no longer relevant. And we'll cover each of them shortly because I want to go through each one of them. But some of them can be beneficial. I mean, most of them had some sort of kernel of truth at some point. So flipping it on its head and playing a little devil's advocate before we get into the details, what's the harm? Why is it so important to avoid propagating these types of recommendations if they have some possible area or some situation where it might actually be helpful?
Yeah, I'm really, really glad you asked this because it's one of the most common questions. And I think the answer is that we need to think a little bit about what it means for something to be generally beneficial. So in my mind, something is beneficial when that guidance reduces the chances of account compromise or device compromise against the most common attacks. And when we think about the advice that we see in the wild, we want to understand how to separate the possibility from the probability. Some of these attacks were absolutely possible in the past. Whether or not they occurred is debatable. But the probability of somebody falling victim to those today is very, very low. And so, again, back to the attention span, people are busy. Some of these things are complicated. And we need to honor their attention by giving them the advice that is going to really reduce the chances of compromise. And when we give them advice that doesn't directly improve their security posture, we're robbing them of the time and effort to do the things that really will help them. It's an act of misdirection. And so I know people get a little squirmy when I say this, but I think it's actively harmful. So, do you want to tell people to avoid lightning strikes, which happen very rarely? And is that the thing that they should be centering their life on? I wrote a blog post about elevators. What if cybersecurity people gave advice to people who ride in elevators? And it would start off by saying, consider the risks. And every year people are killed in elevator accidents. Now, it turns out the number is incredibly small, and most of those turn out to be elevator maintenance people. And,
Right.
The list, it's not helpful to panic people over the the dangers of riding in an elevator. And so it's actively harmful if you are not teaching them also to look both ways when you cross the street, which is often a cause of accidents. So like I said, people get a little squirmy when I say it's actively harmful, but I think if you just really understand how little time and attention people are able, it's not that they're unwilling, it's that there's just only so much that you can do as just an everyday person to become cyber aware. And if you can do that, that's great, but you're not going to be a cyber expert and you're not James Bond. And, the intelligence agencies are unlikely to be coming after you. If they are, there's different advice for you.
Right, exactly.
There's very different advice. And this is not aimed at those higher value targets at all. This is for everyday people.
Well, and as we've learned over and over, and it's true in cybersecurity just as it is in the real world, humans are really bad at estimating risk, especially when it comes to themselves or maybe their kids. These are things that you kind of get over attached to. And maybe that's the wrong way to put that. But if risk is consequences times likelihood, that's a common formula that's trotted out. A lot of us really get some of that wrong. Like the likelihood part is usually where we miss, because the things that make the headlines tend to be the extravagant, weird cases, and we latch onto those as humans because they seem so severe, and yet like shark attacks and things like that. And they've led to some advice over the years. Some of the other things, like as you were talking about the elevator and some of these other things, and some of these cyber ones, was like, boil water before drinking it. Okay, many, many, many years ago, that was probably really important because we didn't have water treatment facilities. Changing your oil every 3,000 miles. Okay, maybe that used to be a thing, but now we've got engines that last longer. We've got synthetic oils. Wait 30 minutes before you go swimming. There's all these are kind of like things that have survived over the years that maybe once had a grain of truth, but aren't that important. So you've kind of distilled some of these down in cybersecurity. And so let's go through these, because I think they're important and I really want to tick them off. So let's go through these 6 one at a time and discuss like where they came from originally, because they all came from somewhere, and then why they're misleading or misguided or maybe just stale. And let's start with the one you just talked about, which is avoid public Wi-Fi. That definitely used to be a problem. What changed?
Yeah. So a lot changed. So so you asked me where in my career did I see some of these things. One of them was at Twitter. So in 2010, I joined Twitter, and it was fascinating. And one of the things that happened was in the news was that somebody had created a plugin called Firesheep. Mm-hmm. And Firesheep worked on the Firefox browser. And what a clever thing this was. The author knew that back then, most communications between your devices, your laptops, and the services that you use was sent unencrypted. Most services would encrypt your name and password when you would submit that to the service, but then would fall back to non-encrypted traffic after that. This seemed like an okay thing. There were some performance and cost issues around encrypting everything. And so organizations were slow to get on the encrypt everything bandwagon. So what this plugin did was allow you to go to a literal coffee shop, and you could sit there and you would configure your laptop so it would be able to listen to all of the traffic.
A promiscuous mode, yeah.
Absolutely. And so then what it would do is it would siphon up all of this traffic and then display it in a nice, easy to digest way, so that if you were sitting there looking at your Twitter or Facebook account, I could see what you saw. Well, that wasn't all it did, because your session cookies were also sent in the clear back and forth between the other patrons' browsers and the servers. You could push a button and then become them. So not only could you see what they were doing, you could then go read all of their past direct messages and post as them and all sorts of things like that. Obviously, not great. And that really accelerated a lot of initiatives. We had one at Twitter. I know there are other ones at Facebook and others to move everything to HTTPS. Those efforts were dramatically accelerated in light of this yes. plugin. So that was very, very, very helpful. Since then, a lot of other things have improved. So not only have more websites moved to encrypt all of their traffic by default. The browser makers have made it harder for you to stumble upon a non-encrypted page. Operating systems have improved. Certificates used to cost money. Now there's the Let's Encrypt initiative. So now they're free. Better standards, better tools, and more people with expertise. And so the list goes on. And the result is that today, almost all of your traffic is going to be encrypted. And for some of us, like in the US, depending on what operating system you're on, what browser you're on, the numbers are in the high 90%. For me, because this is the sort of person I am, I tap my home network. So I actually have a little mini SIM where I can grab all of my packets and do full packet storage and analysis. So I look at my own phone and my own laptop, and I published a couple blogs that talk about what traffic I saw that was not encrypted. Almost all of it. There was, I think, one website which was abandoned in 2005 or something like that, which of course did not have HTTPS, but basically everything else was. And so that's the end of the spectrum that we're in. I still think we can do better. I still think 100% is the goal, but that's not how the attacks really happen. And we're going to keep saying this, like likelihood and impact. The likelihood of somebody finding a site that you're using that is not encrypted and somehow injecting something that your browser is not resilient against, that your operating system is like, sure, I can imagine scenarios. I could probably construct a few on the fly, but that is so rare that it's not worthy of that sort of treatment anymore. And by the way, I don't know anybody who actually listens to that advice. If you've been to a coffee shop, I mean, you can't find a seat because people have been sitting there all day hacking on their screenplays or whatever it is that they're doing.
Yep. And I know the VPNs are often touted for as a silver bullet for a lot of that kind of stuff too. And even in my class when I tried to explain, yeah, okay, maybe that used to be true, but like VPNs for the purpose of encrypting your traffic is just not really needed anymore because almost all of our traffic is already encrypted. Now, it does hide metadata. There are other reasons to use a VPN, but the one that is usually touted for hiding all your traffic from what's going on in the coffee shop or whatever is no longer really needed.
Well, what it does, a VPN, it will move whatever residual risk there is from one place to another place.
Right.
Maybe that's a net win. Maybe that for you is what you really want, but most people think that it solves the problem. It doesn't. It moves the problem.
Yes.
And also the VPNs have more of a claim around things like privacy than security. But even that claim is somewhat weakened because, and we can talk about this in a moment, I suspect, the privacy landscape is very, very challenging. And your privacy is not only revealed by your IP address, but by a variety of other things too.
Oh, yes. Yep. All right, let's move on. Number 2, never scan QR codes. Of all the security tips in your list, I think this is probably the one that is most misunderstood. And I completely agree. I've actually written a whole blog article on this, but the explanation, even when I try to give it, it feels a lot like splitting hairs. So what's wrong with this advice?
So I'm old, so I've seen a lot of these waves of guidance to not click on any links that are suspicious, whatever that's supposed to mean, or oh my God, link shorteners are going to be the death of us, or don't answer any SMSs from people you don't recognize, don't click on any links. So we see all of these different ways in which scammers have found ways to con people. And what we really need to do is take a look at the separation between the method of delivery from the method of compromise. And the method of delivery, well, there's a lot of different ways that people can deliver that. So email, text messages, phone calls with spoofed IDs, and messaging apps, Telegram or Facebook Messenger, Signal, whatever, social media messages, pop-ups, like the list goes on and on. You can receive a scam message from almost any form. When we get people to focus and to over-index on a particular vector, we're not really teaching them how to protect themselves. We're teaching them to be scared of the latest technology that is there to help them and not to really think about what they should be doing. So if we can separate the method of delivery of the scam from the method of compromise, then we can do a lot better. And so if we say, hey, when you're on an airplane and if there's a captive portal that wants you to log into your Facebook account, that's weird. That actually happened in Australia. So that guy's in prison. So don't just blindly give out your credentials to somebody who asks for it, even if it might seem legitimate at first. Count to 10, count to 9 is there's a
take 9
movement. Take 9, yeah. So take 9 seconds, and you start to realize that this is not what I was expecting. Yeah. And so it's not that there's no way that any of these things can be abused. They can all be abused. The question is, are we over-indexing on the latest thing? Or are we teaching people to think clearly about how the attacks work and how scams are initiated? Or are we just teaching them to be scared about a particular technology?
To paraphrase that, the key to think about this is that it obfuscates a link. It's basically QR codes are basically links for the physical world. They exist in the real world. We scan with our phones, which makes them digital, but they're no different than a link that you would click. They're no more dangerous than a link. The QR code itself, just like the URL itself, is not inherently insecure. It might take you to some place that might trick you into doing something, or even take you to a malicious site. The fact that it's delivered by this square bunch of pixels is not in itself dangerous.
I think that's right. And going back to your question earlier about what's changed, that wasn't always the case. So today, your phone, if you have a relatively modern phone and it's relatively up to date, your basic built-in camera which is part of the operating system. It's going to do the processing of that QR code to take you to where it's going to take you. That wasn't always the case. It used to be that you'd have to go download an app, and there were literally dozens, if not hundreds of these apps. Yep. God only knows what they were really doing behind the scenes. Right. And it was also the case that the operating system vendors needed to do some things to harden the camera in order to make that possible. And so they have worked on that. Have they solved all the problems? Almost certainly not. It's software. Software has bugs, it has vulnerabilities. But they've taken very deliberate steps to reduce the chances that somebody is going to be able to exploit a vulnerability that will then cause malware to infect your machine, for example. That's one of the things that people talk about. Used to be relatively possible. Today, much harder. Nothing's impossible. Nothing's impossible. But the likelihood of that happening is far lower. Also, and you'll hear me say this many times, our reaction to those events is what's important. If we say, oh, this particular manufacturer, if you scan this kind of malicious QR code, results in arbitrary code execution, is our response to tell 1 billion people to change their behaviors, or to tell a handful of companies in the tech space to do better? And we've gotten so used to just focusing on changing end user behavior for 1 billion people that we've just sort of forgotten there's an upstream provider who really could and should be doing better.
Absolutely. And that's a theme I hope we touched on multiple times, because it's really underlying a lot of this. All right. Number 3, never charge devices from public USB ports. Now, I'll admit, I've discussed this in my book and in my class, and I do take pains to explain why the risk is, statistically low. And it is also just a really fun excuse to say USB condom. Let's face it.
It is.
So what's the origin of this tip, and what's the reality for most people?
So a lot of this stems back to a talk at DEF CON, I think in 2011, 2012, something like that. And in this talk, the researchers presented some findings that showed that the fact that USB cables and USB ports not only charge but send data back and forth, which is kind of the nice value proposition. You don't have to have 2 cables. Part of that can introduce a vulnerability if the companies who make the phones haven't done a good job of hardening those interfaces. Guess what they described on stage is that the companies had not done a good enough job of hardening those interfaces. And so not long after, I don't know how many releases it was, but in each subsequent release of both Android and iOS, the products just got a lot harder to compromise. And so again, there was a germ of truth back in the day. To the best of my knowledge, there were no actual compromises this way. Let's assume that there were some that just didn't get reported or whatever. So let's assume there were several. But the number that we have currently in the wild of actual compromises is still 0. So that's the order, that's the end of the spectrum that we're at. Let's assume that it's not exactly 0. Let's assume something happened somewhere at one point. That's just not the way these things work today. So again, we need to hit that F9 recalc to say, based on the things that we know about the landscape and about the tech space, what are the current risks, and the risks are low.
All right, moving on. We're halfway through. Number 4, turn off Bluetooth and NFC. Now, we should probably start by explaining what an NFC is, because I don't think a lot of people understand that that's what that term is. They've probably used it without realizing what it is. And then, even though it's technically true that wireless interfaces are valid attack vectors, why is it that the average cell phone user really shouldn't waste a lot of time worrying about them?
Yeah, so NFC, near field communications, so you use these for a variety of things, if you tap to pay and a variety of things like that. And this is yet another wireless communication protocol. And you're absolutely right. Communications protocols have been very, very common attack vectors. And so we should absolutely ask the question, is this another thing that increases my attack surface? Like, hey, Bob, aren't you always talking about reducing the attack surface? Shouldn't I just turn these things off? For Bluetooth, it depends on your use case. Like if you have a watch that needs to talk to your phone, it's not going to work for you. If you have earbuds, it's not going to work for you. There are many other cases where it's simply not practical for you to go in 3 layers deep and turn something on or off. It just doesn't make any sense. For NFC, it's not clear to me that there's a way to turn that off on all the platforms. For some, it seems like you can't turn that quite off. And again, all software has bugs, so I'm not saying like, if tomorrow there was a revelation that NFC contacts could be exploited in some way, I'd be like, yeah, that sounds like par for the course. What is the company that had this vulnerability doing about it? And what you're going to see is they're working on a fix, or they've already published a fix and you just need to update. So I think it goes back to the probability of this becoming a part of the crime against you, to steal your passwords, to steal your accounts, to steal to infect your machine with malware. Is this how the crimes happen? And the answer is no.
Well, and something else I want to bring up about wireless in particular, and these two in particular, is that they're short range, meaning that unlike internet attacks or someone sending you a message where the link preview is broken on your phone and you get no-click attacks that way, someone has to be relatively close to you. Now, Bluetooth is 33 feet, maybe it's 66 feet now. And, with the right antenna, you might be able to pull that off at a distance. But nevertheless, it's proximity based. NFC, being near field communications, is much shorter than even that. So from a security standpoint, it's even less common because someone actually has to be near you, or they have to have left something opportunistic in a public place, maybe, to do something. But it's the ability to be attacked by it is reduced just by the sheer fact that it requires proximity.
That's right. That's exactly right.
Okay, we haven't really talked about the privacy aspects of that, because one thing with Bluetooth, and as you say, iOS and Android have been trying to address this as well, but for instance, Bluetooth, if you leave it on all the time, can potentially be broadcasting a unique identifier. Now, the way a lot of the operating systems do it now, or try to do it now, is they randomize that identifier to try to make you less trackable. We're not really addressing that issue here, but from a security standpoint, as you say, it works great in movies, and and there are certain probably real world spy scenarios where that might be a thing.
Yes,
but for you personally,
yeah, if you are a high value target, I give different advice.
Yes,
which at the outer edges of that advice is don't use computers.
Right.
And like literally, I'm sorry, we don't know how to make software that's totally safe. And you're absolutely right. The privacy element is. It's a real quagmire, isn't it? It's very, very, very difficult to get your arms around. But it's related, it's tangential, but it's mostly out of scope for what we're talking about. Not entirely, but mostly.
Yep. All right. Well, moving along. Number 5, regularly clear cookies. Now, I think the focus here is on privacy more than security. We just mentioned this because cookies are traditionally used to track us as we navigate the web. They were like the original, the OG thing that someone said, we could use this for something else. And the thing that... as opposed to remembering that I'm logged in, or remembering that I like this color theme when I log into the website, or remember my name so it can address me by it, which oftentimes was stored in cookies. Third-party cookies came around, and all of a sudden now we could use those to track you across multiple websites, and they have been used for that. So first, why is it less important now that we delete these cookies? But second, what about session and login cookies? For security purposes, I've heard a lot of people say, well, I log out every time I go to my bank and I log out immediately. I go log into Facebook and I log out immediately. That could be said to be security advice. So tell us about this tip and its nuances.
Yeah, I mean, if you want to log out all the time, that's probably not a totally terrible thing. It probably doesn't cost you too much. If you have a lot of websites that you're logged into on a regular basis and you go and clear your cookies, you're going to be logging back in again. And by the way, whatever sites that you're logging into, they're just going to go back to tracking you again, or their affiliates and their partners. So in some ways, it seems like it's throwing the baby out with the bathwater. And so the other thing to note, like I said, the world of online privacy is so technically challenging, and there's such a large ecosystem of companies that make big money based on buying and selling, acquiring and monetizing your data. And so there are a multitude of ways that they can track you that don't involve your IP address, that do not involve using cookies. And those are much harder to block. They're not impossible. Some of them are on the outer edges of impossibility.
Yeah.
But anyway, that's why I'm saying there's no real solution. So to the folks who are saying, I choose to perform this action to achieve this privacy goal, my question would be around things like, do you pay for one of the data broker opt-out services to go get rid of your data from the data brokers? That would be one thing to consider. Do you use a plugin like uBlock Origin or EFF's Privacy Badger? Do you, on an annual basis, go to all of the social media companies that you use and go figure out what privacy settings they've added or changed to make sure that you're optimized for the way that you want to do things? There are other sources like Consumer Reports has a thing called Security Planner that will customize a program for you based
wonderful.
on the devices you have. Oh, I have baby monitors and an Android, and I care about privacy. And it will then give you something that is a tailored list to go against. So those are the kinds of things where if you want to spend the time to improve the privacy posture of your online digital life, I would suggest going and thinking about things like that before you start thinking about clearing the cookies. You're right to be concerned about online privacy, so I don't want to wave people off. I also don't want people to think it's impossible, so I give up. But clearing the cookies is not the medicine that you seek.
In a lot of browsers, it's kind of like pop-up blockers, after a while got built into browsers. A lot of the browsers now manage third-party cookies pretty well. And some of them got pretty clever. One of the things I like Firefox has done, and I think it's been copied by others, is they have this notion almost of a cookie jar. And the problem is when you go to site A and site B, if both of those sites have contracted with, let's say, Google to show ads, then by definition, that's a third party on those sites, but it's the same third party. So that they could each drop a cookie from site A and site B, but that one Google, in this case, could get access to both of those from both sites and then say, oh, he was just at site A and now he's at site B, and I can remember that and add that to Carrie's dossier. The way Firefox did this really cool thing where, we'll accept the third-party thing. We'll tell them we took it, but when you go to site B, they don't make that available. They've siloed the cookies for each of those sites, which I thought was really clever. And there's other things they've done too. So a lot of the third-party cookie stuff is kind of being handled for you, especially if you go to the browser and you set your privacy settings to, strict or one of the more higher settings.
Right, exactly.
Okay, last but certainly not least, regularly change passwords. And this is a fun one. This is a classic. It's a classic that even the National Institute of Standards and Technology, or NIST, has only recently scrubbed from its best practices. And I believe they were the source of it originally. And
that's right.
The guy who did it was interviewed later. And this is hearsay. I've heard this. I don't know if I've read it from him directly, but said oh yeah, I just thought that sounded good and I put it in there. And which is probably the origin of a lot of these kind of things, right? Someone thought, that's probably a good idea. Let me just throw that in there. And because it was in a NIST document, it became de facto standard. So I can still see people, again, reasoning through their heads, well, why shouldn't I change my passwords? It couldn't hurt. Why? So why is this? Why would you not give this advice?
Yeah, like if you want to go change your passwords every day, knock yourselves out.
Right.
Who are we to tell you what to do? But you're also right to note that some of these decisions are made based on the best available information people have. And it turns out in the world of cybersecurity, we just don't have nearly enough information. So people are doing the best. I mean, we sort of chuckle, but like my guess is that he really thought long and hard about what advice to give, and that this was the best that they could come up with based on available evidence. And we now have more evidence, especially from companies that have millions or billions of users, about how account compromises actually take place. And so we're better informed than we were before. So we should also separate the advice that NIST gives to services that allow people to log in versus the advice to individuals. And sometimes those docs are really not clear about that. And so we really need to work to tease that apart. So yes, they gave that advice. It was also picked up in mainstream press as advice to individuals. But again, that's not really very helpful. And so now we have a better understanding of what makes for good passwords and why you want to have what we call strong passwords. And NIST, I don't think that they've formally defined what a strong password is, so I have. So I'll just tell you what that definition is.
Please.
So the definition is a strong password is long, so preferably greater than 15 characters. It is randomly generated, preferably by a computer or through dice or some other means, because humans are really bad at that. And it is unique. It is not one that you use on any other website. And ideally, it is unique in the universe. In other words, those strings, no matter how many monkeys are typing on the typewriter, they're just never going to come up with that string of characters. If you do that, you're going to thwart the most common forms of attack. Now, that's super difficult, which is why we've previously talked about things like password managers, which will then handle that. It will create long passwords that are randomly generated that you will never reuse on any other site. So that's what I consider to be a strong password, and it's what sets you apart from everybody else. I still recommend MFA. I still recommend other things. But if we want to have a definition for strong passwords, that's my proposal.
And so why is it necessarily bad then to change them periodically? You said, yeah, sure, if you want to knock yourself out, but it's something that takes time and effort, and even with the password manager, takes up precious time when you could be doing something else. Why is it not important? And you mentioned context, and especially individual versus corporate, for example. I've often reasoned that from a corporate level, sometimes it makes sense to retire passwords from individuals, because we want to make sure certainly that when they leave, they're retired, their accounts are shut down. Right. But sometimes at work, people share passwords. They share them for servers or things like that. So making them rotate them then means that there's fewer people that might remember them or take them with them when they leave. Right. So the context matters.
It absolutely does. And so if you violated one of the rules of strong passwords, like it's not unique because now multiple people are using the same password, well, you're going to have some other compensating control to deal with that, which might mean changing the password on a regular basis. I still would argue you should go back and figure out how to fix your identity and access management system, but I do understand. I do understand. So that's part of it. Part of it also is that the context could include things like, I heard that there's a breach at this company. Well, whether or not it turns out to be true, maybe you just go in and change the password anyway, because it'll take you a couple of minutes. It's not like 5 seconds. You have to go find where they put the password thing, and but it'll take you a couple minutes, but it's not an hour. And so you could certainly do that. Or if the company's notified you that they've had a breach, you could absolutely do that. So there are definitely triggers that would cause me to go change my password on a particular site. But some of the passwords I've had for an extended period of time. And again, the threat model is, what happens if one of those sites has been compromised and I don't know? Well, then the attackers may be able to get into that site, but they're not going to be able to get into any of the other sites. Right. And the most common attack vectors, like I said earlier, relate to password reuse and weak passwords without MFA. Like that's the core of it. So knock yourselves out if you want to go change a password occasionally. Maybe it's a high value account. I'm certainly not going to talk you out of it, but advice for the everyday person to go regularly change their passwords has no basis in the way the attacks actually work.
One thing that drives me nuts, I've been using Password Manager for a long time, and there are still websites I go to today where it can't fill it in properly, because I'm sure the website designer came up with some super clever way to enter your password that is non-standard. Furthermore, it seems to me like, and LastPass tried to do this, and I think even Bitwarden maybe had this, where if you tell it a website, and only for certain websites, you can say, I want to go change my password, click one button. And it knows that particular website and knows how to go to that particular website's account information to change your password, because it's not standardized either. Why have we not standardized that? And then at the end of the day, our passkey is going to just obviate the need for all of that.
Yeah, I think that's the $64,000 question. Yeah, so it's very frustrating to go to a site. First of all, there's still sites that block you from using a password manager,
Yes.
which is insane. It's absolutely insane. I see social media posts about this every now and then. It's far worse. It was far worse 5 or 10 years ago, but like today, it's still not perfect. And to your point, we have not standardized on the flows so that password managers, because what they have to do is they have to go write custom scripts to go figure out what is the URL, what is the name of the individual fields, and so they have to go figure that out. And that's great, but they can't do that for every site. And so you're absolutely right. We haven't standardized on that. But things like passkeys are starting to show some movement. And so I first deployed passkeys in the form of security tokens in 2019. And that was very, very painful. That was very, very painful. We were among the first to do that at the DNC. And I would not recommend that experience to everybody else. Having said that, the ecosystem has matured. The service providers are a lot better. The administrators for enterprises, they now can get reports that explain who's logged in with a security key and who the scofflaws are, so you can go hunt them down and make them enroll. So that was one of my big problems back then. And so passkeys are a new model that really don't rely on the same series of fixes. Like we have MFA to try to fix the passwords, and we have password complexity requirements, which we used to think were great and now we think we're bad. Like we're trying to polish the wrong thing. We're trying to finesse and improve the wrong thing. And so we now have an example of what could a login experience look like, and it's much better. Now passkeys still have a number of usability problems, but I use them every day, so they're at a stage where at least certain groups of people are using them on a regular basis. And I think it's got to be the future. We can't seem to get passwords right. There's really no way to make them right. We have to come up with something better. And the one thing that passkeys do that is really underappreciated is, even though it's one of the selling points, when you do what the attacker says and you go to the site and you try to log in, if it's a hoax website, if it is an imposter website, they cannot become you.
Right.
I mean, it's such a remarkable thing. It acknowledges the fact that we will all be phished. We will all be scammed. And if you think you're too smart to fall for a scam, you're the perfect mark. And that's something that we need to understand is that when you fall for the scam, hook, line, and sinker, you still cannot give them the keys to your account. What a remarkable technology.
That's often something I tried out about password managers just with regular passwords as well, is when you go to the phishing sites or when you go to the lookalike sites that use puny code to look like apple.com, it's not really apple.com. Your human eyes can't tell the difference, but your password manager can, and it won't offer to fill it in. So if you go to the site that looks like apple.com, but it's not offering to fill in your password, it's probably not apple.com.
That's right. Don't go in and type it. If you know your password, you're probably in trouble.
Yes, that's also true. So, okay, one more thing is the problem that we also still have with all these things is that the recovery mechanisms we use for all these accounts are really the weakest link. If you're still using a site that has, okay, well, you can't log in, so answer me these 3 questions. Or that's why people don't think that their email accounts are that important. But whenever you say, I forgot my password, where does that reset link go? It goes to your email account. So we still need to somehow tighten up the other end of this, is where the recovery mechanisms we use for our accounts aren't so bad, because that's where all the bad guys are going to go.
Yeah. In enterprises, there's one form of this problem, which is you think, well, it's centralized and the recovery mechanism goes to an employee who knows what to do. But we've seen a whole bunch of major attacks where the help desk people themselves are the ones who get compromised.
Of course.
And then, so that's a challenge. And then, I mean, same for individuals. Like, it's
people are always going to be the weakest link at the end of the day.
It is, but I think we have the opportunity to start to reframe that. So, for example, when you take a look at other sectors outside of software and they start to talk about root cause analysis and systems thinking, they'll use words like the proximate cause of an incident versus the ultimate cause. So if you ask a few more whys, like, well, why did they click on the link? Well, because they were fooled. Like, okay, but then what happened? Well, the thing ran some code. Like, well, why did the system allow a bad guy to run code? And if you follow that, if you start to chase that thread, you'll find that the system was designed to be brittle. And so what we want to do is get to a point where we acknowledge that humans will fall for the scams and that they'll make innocent mistakes.
Yeah.
And so you want to build systems that are resilient.
Absolutely.
So what I would offer is next time we hear the phrase human error was the cause of a thing, to ask a few more whys. And maybe it was not the human, maybe it was the design of the system.
Very true. Very true. Okay, so we had the 6 specific things, and you went to a great trouble to put these down, but I have to wonder, were there some that didn't quite make the cut? Were there any other old security maxims or tropes that you considered but didn't quite make the cut?
So I'm going to give you the 2 that come to mind, but I'm sure your listeners will shoot me several more notes. One of them is webcam covers.
Okay.
And so does that help? Does that not help? Are people getting their laptops and their phones compromised, and are people watching and listening to them? There are a number, with the most recent crop of laptops and phones, there are a number of safety mechanisms there to alert you when the microphone is working and when the camera is on. But we didn't have consensus about what models, how recent. It was just a thorny thing. And then, by the way, if you see a yellow light, what does that mean? If you see a green light, what does that mean? Like, I see those on my phone, and I couldn't right now in this moment tell you what that actually meant. Was it audio or video? So there was just enough confusion that we wanted to keep things very, very simple and very basic. And the second one was the ad blockers, which I mentioned a moment ago. So yes, they are able to help certain kinds of problems, certain kinds of people in certain circumstances, but they also break some sites, and they also are not at the core of how most accounts get compromised. And so certainly worth doing as something that builds on the basics, but we wanted to focus on the basics.
Obviously, these things evolve over time. That's why we got some of these in the first place. Are you planning to keep this list up to date? How often are you going to update it?
We'll have to see. So we just launched this a few weeks ago,
right.
and I guess in one model, maybe we solve the Hacklore for those particular items, and then we can just retire the site. But we might try to expand it over time. But I think one of the things I've learned is that consistency around the basics is a powerful, I think this is something that a model that you share as well. Consistency around doing the basics,
yes,
and not letting people off the hook for those is really key. So I think for the foreseeable future, we'll continue with this list.
So what kind of response have you gotten from your open letter? Like, feedback from journalists that commonly give advice in mainstream media, or policymakers even, or organizations? What kind of response have you gotten?
So the response has been surprisingly good, because I know I've argued with a lot of people on the internet over the years about many of these things, and so I know people have deeply held beliefs. I've had, without saying which governments, but I've had people reach out and say, nice work on all of that. So I think that part of it is that we may have been in the right time, in the right place, that people have sort of noticed on their own that nobody gets compromised this way. And so having us come out and say it may be just a well-timed event. Also, it doesn't hurt to have 100 security professionals to say this is something that we believe. And so I think it's overall been very good. There are, of course, some people who have some concerns, many of those around the fringes, like, okay, the QR code parking meters, like, okay, we can have a conversation about that. The edge cases around privacy on public Wi-Fi, okay, we can have a conversation about that. That's fine. But overall, surprisingly good. And so, let's find out. I have also reached out to a number of different people. I don't have anything to announce yet, but a few organizations have been very receptive, and I've had meetings just to walk them through the logic. And change is slow, especially for larger organizations, but hopefully over the course of the next year, we'll see some very important announcements coming out from organizations who really did not understand that they were spreading Hacklore.
You've kind of ticked these off as you go, but let's formally do it. What are the best practices? What are the things we should be doing in place of these? What is the low-hanging fruit, the most bang for the buck for most people? Let's just tick those off.
Yeah. So in the Hacklore.org letter, we really just focused on 4 things, and they're all three of those are very, very closely related. The first one is the one that's a little bit different, which is keep your critical devices and applications updated. And so we want to focus people's attention on the places where they are logging in to do email, financial services. You mentioned email. Email is your trust anchor. It's where all the password recovery goes. So email, financial services, cloud storage, identity apps, things like that, and to enable automatic updates. So that's the first one. And the next three are basically variations on the theme, which is enable MFA, which I know that you've promoted anywhere and everywhere, to make sure, especially around those primary critical services, and passkeys wherever possible to dip your toe in the water, because I think that is the coming things. And so strong passphrases, not just passwords, but passphrases. And I described what I think the three characteristics of a strong pass word or phrases are. And then use a password manager. Since we all have hundreds of accounts, we can't possibly remember a bunch of randomly generated unique passwords, or at least I can't. So a password manager is really going to be key. So really just the real core basics. And again, there's all sorts of other stuff that you can do on top of that. And there are lots of resources on both our resources page, but also places like the Consumer Reports Security Planner, a variety of other things like that. All great to build on the solid foundation.
All right, so this again, maybe this is probably one of the key parts of all of this, and maybe something we could talk about in the future. But how do we transfer responsibility for security back to the hardware and the software vendors? Because I think you're right. We blame the victims way too often, and we can't expect everyone to make up for the shortcomings of these devices and things that everybody is using. So what is it going to take to put the responsibility back where it belongs?
This is the core of the Secure by Design movement. So this is something that we started in earnest at CISA a few years ago. And CISA is the Cyber Defense Agency for the U.S. And we really do need to transfer responsibility for the most common sorts of problems back to the solution architects at these companies. And we really need to find ways to make sure that we are not constantly in this cycle of celebrating the villains and the things that they did right, turning around and shaming the victims and what they did wrong, when we could be looking to the vendors, which is the third word that starts with the letter V, the vendors who make these products where in some cases the attacks are not just possible but inevitable. And there's actually a fourth V that we talk about, which are the visionaries who have been telling us how to do this for decades, and we need to give them the spotlight of our attention so that we can build products that are truly secure by design.
And over the years, I mean, we have gotten better. We have improved things. Certainly the operating system vendors have started including things. Microsoft had a lot of security things in its products for years, but they were never on by default. And Steve Gibson's like to talk about the tyranny of the default, where people, just because you have the capability to do something doesn't mean you're going to do it, because if it's not on by default, people don't think to change it. And so it's not just a matter of having the capability to do these things, but they need to be turned on and enabled by default. There should be no reason why, like you said, if I click on a link and it gets me infected, why was that even possible?
That's exactly the right question. And that used to be a really big problem. And that is rarely a problem today. And we need to both celebrate those victories and say thank you to the tech companies who have reduced the chances of those things happening. They're still possible in some cases, but they've really done a lot. On the other hand, if you take a look at a paper from MITRE from 2007 called Unforgivable Vulnerabilities, and I encourage you to go look it up, you'll see that the most common vulnerabilities that the MITRE analysts thought were unforgivable in 2007 are still the most common classes of coding error in 2025. So while some companies have made tremendous improvements in securing their products on behalf of their customers, the industry as a whole has a long way to go. I mean, imagine car companies having the same class of safety defect for decades on end. Mm-hmm. That's just not something that we would tolerate, but somehow when it comes to software, we say, oh, that's complicated.
Right.
As if building, cars and crumple zones is not incredibly complicated.
Exactly. All right. So as we wrap up here, if I want further help or information, you've already ticked off a few things. What do you recommend? Are there any resources that'll help me understand my particular threat model, which I think I know exactly what you're going to recommend there. Let's plug some other great sources of info and things that regular everyday people can use to learn more.
Yeah, so hacklore.org has a resources page
Yes.
where you can go read up on a bunch of these things. So we wanted to make sure that we were pointing people, after you've done the very, very basics, point people at a lot of other resources to build on that foundation. And so I mentioned the security planner from Consumer Reports a few times. I'm a big fan. I'm also an advisor there, so sometimes they do the things I say, and sometimes not. That's great. I mean, they have to figure out how to balance a lot of different considerations. And then the EFF has a great page on threat modeling. And here's the thing about threat modeling: we have done ourselves such a disservice by giving it such a scary name.
Yes.
Because it's not scary. It's fun. It is thinking like a bank robber trying to pull off a heist. Like, if you get into the right mindset, you're like, well, actually, I've seen a lot of heist movies, Bob. You're like, right, you already know. Like, what are you protecting? Who are you protecting it from? How might they try to get in? And you start asking these questions. And then, is that likely? Is it probable or possible? It's actually very, very fun. So we've really done ourselves a disservice. The EFF page on threat modeling is a very helpful resource to kickstart.
That's an interesting point. I think we do need to come up with a better marketing term for that and to make it more palatable and more fun. I think that's something somebody should work on.
I recommend people watch this movie from the 50s. It's a French film, and you have to get it on DVD, generally speaking, but it's called Rififi, and it is a movie where there's a heist. It's a heist movie, a black and white French film. The scene where they're doing the actual heist is like 25 minutes of no talking. And you think, how boring is that going to be? Like, no, it's riveting because they cannot make any noise, or the alarms are going to go off because they're motion sensor and sound sensing alarms. It's riveting, and it's the same thing with cybersecurity. So anyway, if you approach it in that way, I think you'll find it a lot less threatening.
Well, that's kind of ironic because it seems like the guys at the Louvre should have maybe watched that movie. Should have watched that movie.
That's hilarious. I had not thought of that. That's I had not put the two and two together. That's awesome. That's cool.
All right, last question. What's up? What's next for you? What's next for Hacklore?
So for me, more secure by design things, and we're in the planning process. I'm doing a bunch of work with the great Lauren Zabrick, who is also with me at CISA. And for Hacklore, really just trying to launch it, get the word out. Please check out the site if you're interested. Sign up for the mailing list and send feedback. This is a real big collective effort. But I think the biggest win isn't going to be me doing stuff. I think if 2% of your listeners were to make polite, kind outreach to local reporters, to school districts, to their company, and with the right spirit, if they were to work to help educate and explain how things have changed. It's not that you've done anything wrong or bad, you're not stupid, but things have changed and we need to refactor our advice. If 2% of your listeners did something like that, it would be 10 times, 100 times the impact that I'm having. So anyway, I want to plant that seed with people that there is a call to action for you too.
Fantastic. All right, Bob, it was great to have you back. We'll have to have you back sooner this time. Thanks for coming on the show.
Love it. Thanks.
That was a really interesting interview, and I like Bob's point of view, and I will say that I agree with the basic stance that they're taking, but I want to refine this a little bit, and because I think there's going to be some controversy here. And I'm not going to speak for Bob or the Hacklore folks. I'm speaking for myself. But my take on this notion of Hacklore is that there's a difference between telling people not to do these things and telling people not to do these things first. All of these things have some value. Most of them have no harm. There certainly are cases where public Wi-Fi can be bad. For example, if someone has created a fake captive portal, which we alluded to briefly as we talked today, there are certain cases, yes, where these things have happened or could happen. We're not saying they don't. But what we're saying is if you've got limited time and resources, if you're going to focus on the most important things first, then yeah, use a password manager, use two-factor authentication, keep all your software up to date. If I had to put things in an order and have you work from top to bottom, I want you to do these things first. And then if you get to these other things, that's fine. That's great. There's no harm in doing some of these things. They do have value, certainly in situational cases. We're not saying, or I'm not saying, that these things are impossible. All QR codes are safe. All public Wi-Fi is safe. It's never a good idea to change your passwords. We're not saying that, or I'm not saying that anyway. So there's a difference in saying never do these things, which is not what we're saying. But it's also different from saying always do these things, because we're saying that, okay, yes, there are things that you might want to do. But before you bother with these things, before you worry about these things, focus on the most important, most broadly useful things first. Just to give you an example here, OWASP is an organization which, among other things, puts out a list of the top 10 most concerning web application vulnerabilities or classes of vulnerabilities that need to be addressed. And OWASP stands for Open Worldwide Application Security Project. And they've got this top 10 list that they put out, but they keep it up to date, and it changes over time. Anyway, I'm not going to beat this up too much more, but the point here I want to make is I understand why some of these points are controversial. I can understand why some people would push back on this, but the key here is to say that the advice is not don't do these things. The advice for other people giving advice is don't focus on these things. Don't make these things in the top 5, because they're really not in the top 5 best things you can have somebody do. If they get through the top 5, if they get through the top 10, then yeah, sure, some of these other things might be worth doing, certainly situationally, depending on your situation as a person, as your threat model, or maybe what you're doing right now. Anyway, I don't want to beat this up, but I just want to make very clear what at least my take is on this kind of advice. Okay, so anyway, you heard Bob there. He had a call to action. If you are a journalist or a blogger or an IT person that likes to pass along advice about staying secure, maybe send them a link to the Hacklore site, maybe share this interview with them to at least give them the opportunity to think about this and to hear these arguments before they, go on to give more security advice. And the fact of the matter is there are lots of very simple, mostly free things that we can all be doing and should be doing to improve our baseline security. And the more of us that do these things, the better off we will all be. And it's important then that we focus our precious time and resources on the ones that will do the most good, give us the most bang for the buck. Start there. And if you have time to do more, fantastic. So Bob did mention passphrases. That is an interesting way to create a strong password if you do it right. It's got to be random words, but it's often easier to remember, though. Again, if you're using a password manager, you shouldn't have to remember these things anyway. But maybe a passphrase might be good for getting into your password manager vault. That is a password or passphrase you still need to remember. And we just had my Dragon Challenge Coin promotion end, but that's one of the things you could do with my Dragon Challenge Coin. And I actually created a whole website for this. If you're not familiar with the term D20, it's a 20-sided dice. That's the D part of D20. They're used in Dungeons and Dragons all the time. So one of the things that my Dragon Challenge Coin will actually do is it works as a D20. It's got a little nub at the back side, so it'll spin on the table like a top. And around the edges of the front of the coin are the numbers 1 through 20 in a random order. And when you stop it with your finger, whatever's next to your finger is your D20 die roll. So I created a whole website for this called d20key.com. And of course, there's a link in the show notes where you can use a real D20 or my Dragon Challenge Coin, or you can just have the website randomize it for you to choose some fun random words to make up a passphrase. And if you're not familiar with passphrases, the website has some information on that as well. It also shows pictures of the coin and how they work. So you might want to check out d20key.com. All right, so there's a lot of links in the show notes. Bob mentioned lots of things today, and so I put as much of this as possible into the show notes, including the DNC checklist, the Hacklore site, of course, Bob's essay on elevator security, MITRE's Unforgivable Vulnerabilities paper, Take 9, Consumer Reports, EFF. There's lots of great stuff, including actually a link to that movie he talked about in the show notes. Now, real quick, here's something I got in the feedback. Somebody was having trouble getting to the show notes. Every podcast app probably does this a little bit differently, but if you open the podcast that you're currently playing on your podcast app, there's probably a tab or some way to get to the show notes right there in the player. But if you can't find it there, you can always go to my podcast website and always get the links there. You can go to firewallsdon'tstopdragons.com and click on the podcast tab, or you can go directly to my podcast site, which is podcast.firewallsdon'tstopdragons.com. So you can always get to the links that way. And there's great stuff there. So I just want to make sure that everybody knows how to access that information. All right, so I do want to mention my Dragon coupons as well, since we talked about kind of like the most important things you could be doing for your loved ones if you want to help them get more secure, what kind of advice you want to give. I created some Dragon coupons that help you offer to make people more secure and private. And, it has things like setting up a password manager and setting up two-factor authentication, and actually about over 24 other things. I put a link in the show notes, but if you could remember it, it's fdsd.me/coupons, plural. Okay, so patrons will get some bonus Q&A with Bob on Thursday as usual. I, of course, ask Bob a little bit more about his origin story. We talk about Cliff Stoll, who is the author of The Cuckoo's Egg, which is a great book. If you haven't read it, I highly recommend it. And I am going to see if I can get Cliff on the show. Bob's going to put in a good word for me. So fingers crossed, we'll see if that happens. Cliff's a very interesting person. I also asked Bob why we don't have software liability in this country, in the most litigious country on the planet. And he actually had some interesting suggestions about how we might fix that. And I also asked him a little bit more about his time at the DNC in the wake of the email hacks there. So patrons, you'll be getting that Thursday morning as usual. I got some great shows coming up. The next interview will be with Sean Zadig. He is the current Chief Information Security Officer at Yahoo. Bob was a previous one. Then we're going to be talking with Nicholas Merrill. He's the CEO and founder of a company called Freely, Phreeli. He also has some experience with Calyx, which is a non-Google version of Android for phones. And he is trying to create a more private cell phone service provider. So that will be an interesting discussion. That's coming up soon. Then I'm going to have my panel discussion on surveillance pricing. And another thing that some of my listeners have asked for, they wanted to do more crossover interviews with folks from other podcasts. So I'm actually going to be bringing Nate and Jonah from Privacy Guides on for an interview at some point soon. And I've also got some really good stuff coming up that I don't want to tip just yet, but I've got some great interviews coming up. So if you have not already, subscribe, and then you will definitely not miss any of that great content coming up. All right, that'll do it for this week. Take care, everybody. Stay safe out there. And until next time, as always, don't get caught with your drawbridge down.